Okay, everyone. Today we're going to get started talking about the biological perspective on personality. And there are several approaches. One deals with kind of the nitty-gritty of genetics, and another one area talks about evolution, the theory of evolution, and how that applies to personality. And finally, another approach deals with biological processes that are going inside. So basically, in the textbook, chapters 6 and 7 deal with issues regarding personality from the biological point of view. So let's talk about this basic approach. For the first aspect of it, the idea, particularly when we're talking about genetics, the idea is that personality is genetically determined, and realize that who we are as a person, who we are not just physically but also our personality, is based on biology. Furthermore, the evolutionary theory, evolutionary psychology, takes the point that human behavioral characteristics also have evolved. So essentially, that the aspects of our personality that are most conducive to the survival of our species, successful reproduction, and so on, that is really based on how the species evolved. So essentially, our personalities are based on the evolutionary process. Okay. Another point is that behavior is the product of a biological organism that has enormous complexity. There are billions of neurons in our body, and hormone action that is going on that can have an impact on our behavior. So really, it's a very difficult process to understand our personality, considering the biological mechanisms that are going on within us that are just enormous. So our genetics, our biology, they influence, they basically influence our personality. Biological processes, genetics, and evolution, all of those essentially really play a big part in determining our personality. And there's a lot of research to back this up. But again, this is just, as we'll talk about the entire semester, this is just one approach to the study of personality. Okay, an interesting theory regarding personality. Well, basically, there was basically throughout history, there's the idea that certain body types, things like body fluids or whatever, are relevant when it comes to personality. But basically, William Sheldon came up with an interesting way of categorizing, kind of thinking about personality types. So remember, we go back into the trait perspective. So these represent personality types. Remember, like this type of personality putting into this particular category. And in this particular theoretical perspective, in this particular theory, it has to do with the body type that is presumably associated with your temperament. Okay. So, for example, so he came up with the idea of these somatotypes, and the three somatotypes. These three somatotypes, categorized by Sheldon, are endomorphs, mesomorphs, and ectomorphs. So the endomorph is plump, like your professor. The emphasis is on digestion. The mesomorph is muscular. The emphasis is on bone, muscle, and connective tissue. And the ectomorph is thin, emphasizing the skin and nervous system. And basically, an individual would score between 1 and 7 on each of these three dimensions. Realizing, of course, whenever you're putting people into categories, you're missing out on something. So really, the idea is that everybody has some of all of these. So here's a picture of the various some somatotypes. Here's the ectomorph, here's the mesomorph, and here's the endomorph. Okay. Now, what does this relate to personality? The idea is that there are three aspects of temperament. Temperament is kind of like a general characteristic way of behaving, so we'll talk about, so the three temperaments associated with each of the three somatotypes. Viscerotonia, associated with endomorphy, be relaxation, tolerance, sociability, love and comfort, goodwill, easygoing. Somatotonia, associated with mesomorphs, boldness, assertiveness, desire for adventure and activity. And finally, cerebrotonia, and that's associated with the ectomorphs, avoidance of social interactions, restraint, high pain sensitivity, and mental intensity. Interestingly enough, I mean, this theory is a little bit, it's certainly outdated, but there is some suggestion that there may be at least some kernels of truth to all of this, but the question really is, why? So just describing it as simply body types doesn't really explain what may be going on inside. When we get to talking about the internal biological processes in Chapter 7, I actually may get some answers anyway to what might be going on here. Okay, so let's start talking a little bit about genetics and seeing how that relates to the study of personality. Okay. A lot of research is done. There are two types. So start with twin studies. What are twin studies? Basically, when you have identical or monozygotic twins, or fraternal or dizygotic twins, you have opportunities to conduct research in that you have two individuals, presumably if they're raised together, who are raised in similar environments, but genetically you can kind of test to see how similar they are in various characteristics. Okay, so monozygotic pairs, what's special about them, so these are the identical twins, is that from a genetic point of view, they are identical. They are genetically identical. Okay? And dizygotic twins, they are not identical. They're just like brothers or sisters, or brother and sister. They just happen to be born at the same time and raised at the same time as the identical twins. Okay? So you can look at various aspects of personality. You could look at intelligence, you could look at the big five characteristics, and you can compare the monozygotic pairs with the dizygotic pairs. So in other words, you can see, so John and Joe are both are monozygotic twins. They're identical twins. And maybe you can establish what is the correlation between them in terms of their scores on an intelligence on a personality test. For example, to measure their extroversion, you might find that there's a pretty strong correlation that the identical twins, pretty much, maybe their correlation is about 0.8 or 0.9 in terms of how extroverted they are. Maybe they both share that particular characteristic. On the other hand, the dizygotic twins, maybe the correlation is maybe only about 0.3 or 0.4. Certainly correlated, but not nearly as high as it would be for the identical twins. So what you would do is you would look at the difference between those two correlations and multiply it by 2 to establish what is called the heritability coefficient. And the heritability would indicate the extent to which this particular characteristic can be attributed to genetics. Okay. Now let's look at another approach, looking at adoption studies. In this case, we're not looking at twins necessarily, but we're looking at how a adopted children, they are raised by parents who are not genetically related to them. Okay. How much similarity should there be between children and their adopted parents? Well, there should be some correlation, because the adopted parents, especially if the children have been with the adopted parents for, since early childhood or infancy, then you would basically see, in other words, the parents raise the children the way they think they should be raised, and the children will emulate the parents, and so on. So there should at least be some relationship between children and the adopted parents. The biological parents of the children who are adopted, they basically have little or no contact with the child. So in terms of how they're being raised, the biological parent really doesn't have any influence. But nevertheless, they're genetically related, unlike the adopted parents. Well, it turns out that on many traits, the correlation between children and their biological parents is actually higher than the correlation between children and their adopted parents. And the fact that this correlation is higher suggests that there is certainly a genetic component to whatever traits you happen to be measuring. And it does turn out to be true that there are many different characteristics that children are actually more like their biological parents than their adopted parents, which is interesting, again, revealing that genetics does play a big role in not just our physical appearance, but in terms of our personality.